Russian media won't show you these images. This 10-mile road connecting two villages in the Kursk region looks like a burned-out band with wrecks of military weaponry fuming alongside. Tanks, AIVs, BMPs, trucks, nearly 20 pieces per every mile of the road. For 2 months, the Russian so-called elite Black Berets have been trying to break this front line, which they now call the Road of Death. Yet this is not the largest equipment loss in a single battle, nor is it the worst offensive by the 155th Russian Brigade in Ukraine. The Marines, Black Berets, took part in battles from the first days of the invasion. The brigade suffered significant losses during fighting in the Kiev region, Moshchun, Irpin, and Gostomel, which became part of the battle for Kiev. What happened to the 40-mile-long Russian convoy? On March 31, 2022, Pentagon spokesman John Kirby said, "I don't even know if there is a Russian convoy at this point. They never accomplished their mission, but we can see what happened to it." This convoy had about 100 tanks, 400 infantry fighting vehicles, and armored personnel carriers. It also included Tochka-U and Iskander-M operational and tactical systems, air defense systems, cannon and rocket artillery, pontoon equipment, fuel trucks, and trucks with ammunition and food. But not everyone made it back. Some did not even have time to join the battle. The Ukrainian artillery fire was so intense that within a few days, Ukrainian troops around the capital risked running out of 152mm shells. In addition, mobile groups armed with stingers and javelins provided by the United States were active. Ukrainian aviation and Bayraktar UAVs continued to operate. Another, no less heated encounter between Russians and Ukrainians occurred in the Sumy region, on the left bank of the Dnipro River. The first Russian convoy to reach the city of Sumy on February 24, 2022, was destroyed. Russian troops retreated, deciding to blockade the city instead. Russian convoys were also caught in fire in local battles around Sumy. Local residents who joined the territorial defense actively participated in their destruction. The self-defense forces had some handheld anti-tank weapons, but they were mostly armed with pistols and Molotov cocktails. Ukrainian regular army units met Russian convoys on the outskirts of Kiev. The exact numbers of Russian weaponry burned or damaged in the battle for Kiev are unknown. However, in the first month of the invasion alone, the Russian army lost nearly 500 tanks, over 1,500 armored vehicles, and almost 1,000 trucks in all directions. The Russian paratroopers and Marines were literally crazy about the losses, so they started to put pressure on the local population, and then Putin sent the Black Berets to storm the city of Vuhledar in Ukraine, where they found themselves in an absolute hell. Although the area of the city is slightly larger than the campus of the American Columbia University, its assault lasted 26 months. Today, there are more burnt-out tanks and infantry fighting vehicles on the outskirts of Vuhledar than stones. The Independent War Spotting Project estimates that the Russians have lost about 1,000 tanks, armored personnel carriers, trucks, and artillery pieces here. How could this happen? The fact is that Vuhledar is a small hill in the middle of the Donbas steppe. The city's high-rise buildings resemble fortresses from the Lord of the Rings movie. From the rooftops, you can see what's happening hundreds of yards away, even without optics. So the assaulters need to have a numerical advantage and still be prepared for heavy losses. Assault operations around Vuhledar took place every day. However, 2 attacks are considered the most significant losses of weaponry in the war in Ukraine. The first decisive assault began in November 2022. Initially, the Black Berets had to take Pavlivka, located 500 yards south of the city. Armored vehicles with mine trawls were the first to attack, and they were supposed to punch corridors in the minefields for tanks and other armored vehicles. However, something went wrong right away. Heavy rains turned the steppe into a swamp, and the vehicles that followed the trawls stuck in the soil. As a result, the transmission of the brigade's brand new T-80BV tanks and BMP-3 infantry fighting vehicles overheated and could not withstand the load. Therefore, the vehicles stopped after a very short time and could not move on. The assault withered away, but the Black Berets never heard the order to retreat. The Russian tanks and armored vehicles remained in the middle of the steppe, as if they were on a training ground. In a few minutes, They faced what is known in military parlance as the fire bag. They had been trained to land on the Japanese island of Hokkaido, but no one had taught them how to operate in the middle of the Ukrainian steppes. The Ukrainians fired ATGMs from the roofs of 9-story buildings at tanks. Mortars, artillery, and kamikaze drones covered trucks and armored vehicles. And almost every shot was accurate because the elevation difference between Volodar and Pavlivka is about 100 feet. At a distance of 500 yards, this is a lot, and therefore convenient for the defending side and very inconvenient for the attacking side, especially considering the utterly open terrain. Do you think someone stopped this massacre? Of course not. During the 4 days of this assault, the 155th Brigade lost 50% of its equipment, but there was still no order to stop or retreat until those who could have carried out this order disappeared. This assault was stopped due to the complete defeat of the Black Berets. However, 3 months later, the tragedy repeated itself, but in the form of a farce. Finally, everyone learned the name of the commander who sent the Black Berets to the massacre. But first things first. So, the failure did not stop the Russian command. The assault on Volodar continued. The Russians attacked every day, but with smaller forces, and each time the result was the same: buried weaponry. But during this time, other units also arrived to help the Black Berets for a new decisive assault. Most likely, due to the heavy human losses, there were no witnesses to the war crimes in Bucha among the personnel of the 155th Brigade. Thumbs up if you have similar thoughts. So, at the end of January 2023, the assault, consisting of many waves of attacks, began. But each subsequent wave of Russian armored vehicles turned into torches. If last time the situation resembled a shooting range with static targets, this time it was a shooting range with moving targets. During the first days of the assault on Volodar, Russia lost at least 130 armored vehicles, including 36 tanks, and this was at a distance of 500 yards. The Ukrainians mined all the nearby fields, leaving only dirt roads unmined. They used the Remote Anti-Armor Mine System, or RAMS. These are 2 different types of 155mm howitzer shells, each containing 9 anti-tank mines, one with a self-destruct time of more than 24 hours, and one with a self-destruct time of less than 24 hours. As the Russian troops moved in a line, anti-tank gunners hit the lead and closing vehicles. Then the column was straddled by fire from M777s and Caesars. In some cases, a HIMARS battery joined the battle. Getting into trouble and trying to turn around, the Russian tanks drove into a minefield, bloated, and got in the way of other vehicles in the column, finally slamming the trap shut. In this way, the Ukrainian military repelled several waves of attacks. General Rustam Muradov was appointed the culprit of the catastrophic losses near Volodar. Putin first promoted him to the rank of Colonel General and then fired him. In the Kremlin, Muradov was nicknamed the Devil's Butcher. The Russians changed their tactics and used less equipment in their attacks. Instead of modern T-80BVs, BMP-3 and BTR-82 infantry fighting vehicles, which had been lost in previous attacks, the brigade received T-54B tanks made in 1957-59, T-62s produced since 1961, and old BTR-50 and MTLB armored personnel carriers with logs attached to protect them from FPV drones, because the armor of these combat vehicles cannot withstand even a large caliber machine gun. And then, the Russian army wiped Volodar off the map, but that's another story. However, there is a place in Ukraine where the concentration of destroyed equipment per acre is even higher. Zmainy Island is about 30 times smaller than Volodar. Russia seized it on the first day of the invasion, but the liberation of the island was a brilliant operation of this war. Share your thoughts in the comments if you want to see a separate video about this multi-day operation. The cost of military equipment destroyed on this tiny piece of land reaches almost $1 billion. We're talking about several units of Pantsir, Strela, and Tor SAMs, 2 Tornado and Grad MLRS, radar and electronic warfare systems, 2 infantry fighting vehicles, and 8 trucks. However, if we add the ships sunk off the island's coast here, we can probably talk about a world record for the cost of lost equipment per acre of land. It was here that 2 Ukrainian Neptune missiles sank the Moskva missile cruiser, the flagship of the Russian Black Sea Fleet. The Bayraktar UAV destroyed Raptor boats and a small landing craft. The Black Sea Fleet tugboat Vasily Bek, which was transporting ammunition and equipment to the island, was sunk by a Harpoon missile. After the Russians were forced to leave the island, the Ukrainians planted their flag there and put an end to this battle. Did you know that there is a section of the front line in Ukraine where fighting has been going on for more than 10 years, since 2014? It is Avdiivka. Calculating all the losses in this area is impossible, because it would require excavations and hundreds of thousands of photos and video documents. But in just 4 months of a decisive assault from October 10, 2023 to February 17, 2024, during the storming of Avdiivka, Russian troops lost 47,000 people killed and wounded, 364 tanks, 748 armored combat vehicles, 248 artillery systems, and 5 aircraft. Yes, the assaults on Volodar and Avdiivka and the liberation of Zmin are impressive in terms of the amount of Russian equipment destroyed, but this is not a record of the amount of equipment lost. What do we mean by that? How about this fact? The largest supplier of tanks and armored vehicles to the Ukrainian army was the Russian army. What? How can this be? Look, on September 6, 2022, the Ukrainian army launched a counteroffensive in the Kharkiv region. As a result of the Ukrainian breakthrough maneuver, the Russian defense line crumbled. Ukrainian units could build on their success, crossing the river and advancing in all directions. The Russian army could only suspend the Ukrainian counteroffensive on October 11th. Ukrainians liberated more than 3,200 square miles. The Wall Street Journal, citing data from Oryx analysts, reported that during the counteroffensive, the Ukrainian military captured 460 Russian main battle tanks, 92 self-propelled howitzers, 448 infantry fighting vehicles, 195 armored fighting vehicles, and 44 multiple launch rocket systems. Impressive, isn't it? But the actual numbers of captured equipment may be even higher. How could this have happened? The art of deception in military operations has always been a key tactic in the history of warfare, and the Kharkiv 2022 counteroffensive is a fascinating example of this art. So first, the Ukrainian army launched a counteroffensive on the opposite side of the front, on the right bank of the Dnipro River in Kherson Oblast, and even liberated several villages. The Russian command saw this as a threat to Crimea, so some units from eastern Ukraine were redeployed to Kherson. For example, the 18,000-strong Russian grouping in Izium was halved. But the Ukrainian army suddenly changed the direction of the attack, launching an offensive in the Kharkiv region. Before that, each attacking brigade was armed with at least 8 M777 howitzers. Additional drones were also deployed to enable the brigades to pinpoint targets and consume less ammunition. On September 6th, just after 3:30 a.m., a part of Ukraine's 25th Airborne Brigade began to move in small columns of 3 infantry fighting vehicles. A few hours before they started moving, Ukrainian artillerymen fired on Russian positions using American 270 multiple launch rocket systems. By the end of the first day, the Ukrainians had advanced about 11 miles, reaching the edge of Volokiv Yar, a key intersection that allowed them to block the 2 main highways leading to Izium. This was a success, as the Russian command failed to stabilize the situation. The front fell apart. Sun Tzu, author of The Art of War, stroked his beard in the sky with satisfaction as Russian General Lapin darted along the front line and threatening Russian soldiers with his pistol. When the Ukrainians entered Izium, they were stunned by what they saw. Serviceable tanks ready to go, abandoned artillery pieces ready to fire, fuel tanks filled to the brim, tons of ammunition and light weapons. The defeat in the Kharkiv region shook Moscow. It is now known that in those days, Putin was ready for a nuclear strike, as stated by CIA Director William Burns. At the behest of President Joe Biden, Burns met with his Russian counterpart in 2022 to emphasize the consequences of nuclear escalation. This may have sobered the Russian dictator, but for how long? Share your thoughts in the comments, and be sure to subscribe to our channel.